Slouching Towards Utopia is the name of an award-winning book of economic history by economist J. Bradford DeLong. In that book, he outlines a number of different economic phenomena over the last 150 years. But his contention is that the two most important ones that have shaped modern society are the Industrial Revolution, or industrial revolutions, and the continuing prominence and power of free markets. And I think he's right, because from those two things, a number of modern cultural phenomena and personal phenomena have emerged. One of them is the rise of the corporation. Another is the rise of consumer culture. And arguably a third is the rise of individualism and the prominence of people just being told and nurtured and encouraged to go after what they want. Now, from all of these trends and these collective phenomena operating together, a number of disciplines have emerged, new academic disciplines that hadn't really been thought about distinctly until the last 150 years or so. One of them is the discipline of leadership and management theory. And leadership and management theory is interesting because it's been talked about and has emerged as its own discipline, but a lot of its principles have been and continue to be transposed into the realm of personal development and self-help. And we see these particularly with three of the core principles of leadership and management theory: strategy, culture, and character. Strategy, culture, and character have been talked about by the leadership theorists for a couple of hundred years now. But more recently, they've been transposed into their continuing and growing relevance for each of us as individuals. How does strategy, culture, and character relate not just to our organizations and our institutions, but to ourselves and our families and communities? And different strands of leadership thinking and different strands of psychological thinking have begun to grow up, placing different levels of emphasis on each of these three concepts: strategy, culture, or character. So the question then naturally emerges, which one is most important? And more importantly, how do they relate to one another? And how can we helpfully think about them? Well, first of all, strategy. Now, the concept of strategy has been around for many, many generations and thousands of years, but it first comes to prominence in the literature and in historical records in 6th century Rome. And it's particularly prominent there in the context of military strategy. But its meaning and its core substance is the same now as it was then. It's about desired ends with available means. How are we going to get where we want to go and get what we want with the available means and resources that we have? And so strategy has been always and continues to be about the efficient allocation of resources to get where we want to go. Now, interestingly, we see strategy even in the Bible. We see it in the Apostle Paul's letter to the Roman Church. Now, this is a letter that's correctly understood as a great work of systematic theology and Christian doctrine. But in Romans chapter 15, we see Paul writing and thinking strategically. And we see through this chapter that the book of Romans is a letter of strategy as much as it is a letter about theology as well. In Romans 15, Paul is writing to the Roman Church and he's talking about his strategy. His geographic strategy, his spiritual strategy, his missional strategy. He says, I'm coming to Spain. I need a base out in Western Europe. I'm looking forward to you guys supporting me and helping me financially, in terms of resources, in terms of connection. And we see Paul trying to achieve his outcomes of carrying the gospel to Western Europe in and through a very thought-through strategy. So we see the importance of strategy for thousands of years, how we get to where we want to go with the available means and resources that we have. As important as strategy is, there is a problem if we are strategy-centric. If strategy is all we're thinking about, if strategy makes up exhaustively our entire focus, there are going to be issues. And the primary issue is this: a strategy-centric approach focuses exhaustively and exclusively on outcomes. All we're interested in is in what happens, in getting to where we want to go. It's interested only in outcomes. And because of that, a strategy-centric approach can quickly become amoral. Not immoral, but amoral. And there can be no sense of what's actually right and wrong. What's right and wrong about the outcomes we're looking for? What's right and wrong morally about how we get there? What's right and wrong about us and how we're thinking and how we're relating to other people? We can quickly become engulfed with the outcomes, with the strategic outcomes, with this exclusively strategic mindset. And so because of that, while strategy has always been important, it was quite clear as the 20th century developed that organizations, individuals, communities, institutions were going to have to think beyond strategy. And one thing they shifted to was this issue of culture. The concept of culture quickly and clearly became something that had to accompany the concept of strategy in leadership and organisational theory, and also for individuals in a personal development context. Secondly then, culture. While strategy was always considered important, it was clear that moral content had to become involved in the process and in organisational theory and in personal development. And culture was the way that that began to happen. Pete Drucker, one of the great organisational theorists and philosophers, defined culture as shared beliefs, attitudes and behaviours. And there's plenty more that could be said about culture, but that's a helpful working definition. Drucker also went on to say that between strategy and culture, culture eats strategy for breakfast. If the two are ever matched off against each other, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And he was speaking because of the moral content that culture brings. While strategy is focused entirely on outcomes, culture begins with values, what we believe in. Ginny Rometty, the former CEO and chairperson of the IBM Corporation, she was asked, "What is your strategy?" And she said, "Don't ask me what my strategy is. Ask me instead what I believe in. Ask me about my culture. Ask me about my values. That's a far more important question." What Pete Drucker and Ginny Rometty understood was that strategy alone is not enough. It focuses entirely on outcomes and, at its worst, in an amoral way. Culture has some moral content. It talks about and thinks about and considers values. And once again, we see Paul in the book of Romans speaking to this need for moral content. In Romans 1:8, at the beginning of his letter to the Roman church, he says, "Your faith is being proclaimed all over the world." Your faith is being proclaimed all over the world. He's talking about cultural reputation. He's talking about their shared beliefs, attitudes, and behaviours, their faithfulness to the gospel message, their faithfulness to Christ. That was the culture of the Roman church. And Paul, once again, is referring to it in his letter to the Roman church. We see at the end of the book of Romans, he talks about strategy. At the beginning of the book of Romans, he's talking about culture. Culture and strategy go hand in hand. Strategy alone is not enough. It focuses at its worst entirely on outcomes, whereas culture focuses, at first instance at least, on values. There is, of course, a problem though, because while an entirely strategic approach can be too focused on outcomes, an entirely culture-based approach can be too focused on behaviours. And so while culture does bring the moral content that we need, that sense of right and wrong, the need for values, perhaps values of integrity, of honesty, of humility, of excellence, all of these values that we see around the professional and private world today. We talk about culture fit and culture shaping and making sure that you're aligned with the culture of the organisation you work for. It can just end up being about behaviours. The values are there, but there's nothing internal. It's still external to who we are. So you can have the right strategy and you can have the right culture, but it's still about how people are externally. And so having considered the importance and relevance of strategy and the importance and relevance of culture, we come to the third key concept, character. And while strategy focuses entirely on outcomes and culture focuses entirely on values, character does something that's qualitatively different. It takes the strategic perspective of a strategy-centric approach, and it takes the cultural perspective of values, but it turns it in on individuals. It's introspective. It goes inside the personal ethics of someone. It's qualitatively different to strategy because there is a moral element, and it's different to culture because it's not just about what happens out here. It's about what happens in here. It's beyond outcomes and it's beyond behaviours. It's upstream. It's about our personal ethics. Now, C.S. Lewis spoke about morality in the context of ships on the water, ships on an ocean. And he framed it in two ways. He said, first of all, social ethics. Social ethics is about how the ships relate to each other. They can't be crashing into each other. They have to be sailing alongside each other well. That's social ethics, how we relate to one another. But there's something more important, personal ethics. The condition of the ships internally, the condition of their engines and their structures and their materials, how well they are taken care of. Personal ethics is about character. It's not so much about our strategy, what we want and how we get there. And it's not even so much about our culture, what we value. It's actually about who we are inside, ethically and ontologically. Now, the problem and challenge, of course, today is that the world tends to ignore the importance of character the importance of personal integrity, the importance of personal ethics. Instead, it encourages and seeks to foster an outward-facing posture. An outward-facing posture based on what we want, based on desire and preference, based on our feelings, based on the things that we seek to achieve and the things that we want for ourselves. And various philosophers and thinkers have talked about this concept in different ways. Robert Bellah talked about the age of expressive individualism. Charles Taylor, the moral philosopher, calls it the age of authenticity. And thinkers like Alistair MacIntyre, another moral philosopher, talks about emotivism. This idea that we can kind of build our own moral truths for ourselves. We see it in our common hashtags and handles today. You do you, your best self, your best life. This is effectively the age of self-actualization, getting what we want. And strategy and culture have kind of become buzzwords in order to get us there, to satisfy ourselves. Interestingly, we see this in the Bible too. And we see it in commentaries. Great Christian thinkers like Martin Luther and St. Augustine, who said, sin is men and women curved in on themselves. Sin is us curved in on ourselves. And that's effectively an ignoring and a negating of the importance of character, how we treat one another, our personal ethics, as well as our external actions and desires. In contrast to the prevailing cultural narratives out there today, the Bible says that character has to come first. Strategy is important, as we see from the end of the book of Romans. Culture is important, as we see from the beginning of the book of Romans. But character has to come first. How we are and who we are has to precede what we do and what we want and how we do it. It's from our personal ethics, from a place of integrity and humility and love and virtue and sacrifice, that positive cultures can then authentically be built, beyond just plaques on a wall or fridge magnets, but actually reflecting the hearts of people and how we think about ourselves and how we think about others. And from these positive cultures, then effective strategies can be placed over the top to get us to where we want to go, as individuals, as families, as communities, as businesses, and as institutions. If culture eats strategy for breakfast, and I think it does, then character eats culture for breakfast. It's not that the first two are not important. It's that character has to precede culture, and culture then precedes strategy. Who we are is more important than what we believe, which is then more important than our outcomes. But they all sail together. Character, though, has to come first. So the question then becomes, how do we improve our character? How do we transform our character? Well, all of the personal development and self-help literature out there suggests different ways, admittedly, but it's all up to us. We have to pull ourselves up by our moral bootstraps. We just have to do better and be better somehow. The problem is, as Isaiah Berlin, the philosopher, said, we are working with broken ingredients. We are dealing with the crooked timber of our humanity. And it's become quite clear through history alone, as much as through personal experience, that our efforts to improve ourselves morally in our own strength have failed and continue to fail. Thankfully, Paul once again is onto this, and in the book of Romans, he deals with this head on. We've seen how he addresses the importance of strategy at the end of the book of Romans and nods to the importance of culture at the beginning of the book of Romans. The rest of it, arguably, is about character and personal transformation. We see it most beautifully and directly in Romans chapter 12. In verse 2, Paul says, we are all invited, every single person, into a relationship with Jesus, and through that, to the renewing of our minds. It's inward transformation. Paul is writing about character transformation. He's writing about how important and wonderful our transformation of character is when we receive the love of Jesus and begin to love others in that same sacrificial way. From what we've talked about, we see how strategy is preceded by culture, but culture is preceded by character. And character is renewed and formed in and through love and relationality, specifically the love of Jesus Christ. When we are walking with him, receiving his love and practicing his love, our character begins to change. Our posture is turned from one that is inward focused on ourselves and what we want to being sacrificial and outward focused on the good of the families and communities and organizations that we are a part of. In that moral environment, then authentic cultures can be built. And in that cultural environment, then effective strategies can then be put in place. It's not so much about which one's more important, strategy, culture, or character. It's about how they relate to each other. And it all begins with love. Love that transforms our character, that then feeds into our cultures, that then makes good on strategies. Thanks for watching.
Hey guys, how are you doing? My name's Nathaniel and I'm part of the Ocker team. And I just wanted to say a big thank you for watching this film we made. At Ocker, we really love to speak about the big questions of our time and to show how the Christian faith provides credible and valuable answers. If you've enjoyed this film, check out the other stuff on our channel, and also please consider subscribing and following us. It really helps to make more films like this. We also want to hear from you, so if you have any ideas for new content, please put them in the comments below or get in touch with us directly. Thanks goes out to all the speakers, donors, and film team, of which I'm a part of. And actually, fun fact, it takes around 60 hours to make all of these films. And that's because we want to make sure the content is incredibly well researched, it looks and it flows beautifully, and ultimately, that it's actually useful to you. So this means a lot of research, listening to our audience, and filmmaking. Our incredible staff at Ocker who make these films are funded by donations. So if you want to partner with us with our work, please also consider donating, which is really easy on our website. See you next time.